So for those of you who were at dinner last night, Stefano Battorini, I think, already gave a very nice title for a book on Italian election, A Country That Does Not Want to Change. I would add on the Dutch election, or on Dutch elections, the Netherlands, a country that's addicted to change. So the amount of change you see politically, in personnel, in issues, it's staggering. It also shares with Italy, of course, a very proportional electoral system, so you're going to see that, but even nonetheless, just if I studied in Germany, and at the time when I left Germany in 2002, and then at a certain point when I came back years later, Frans Muntefering was still the general secretary of the SPD. In the Netherlands, it goes so fast, you don't even know who is the party leader or the head of the party. So really interesting results, and I think both of you have really tried in your individual papers to try to make sense of them. So a lot of material, very timely, a lot of different types of data, and I will talk to both those projects in turn. So in the Ditmars et al. Paper, so it's very nice because the kind of discussions we had about competence, you guys are trying to move beyond just positional to valence issues as well, and that's very important. I think the paper is interesting for those people who are interested in Dutch politics. I think also the Partij van de Arbeid, so the Labour Party, might take note in the sense that this kind of GPS politics of trying to find where voters are is not really kind of working. They're not seeming to kind of update very much, but maybe they should read your paper. So in order to make it better and to just kind of, rather than, of course one can have different ways of doing it, different ways to empirically and theoretically approach, but let's not go into kind of that tug of war, but just kind of you guys do what you've decided to do, and I'll try to think a little bit about how you could go from there and make it better. So I think for someone who is not me, i.e. interested in Dutch politics, you need to kind of frame the paper as to why this particular election is so important, or do something longitudinally. And I think the Dutch kind of election, or the Dutch debate, and I've kind of was asked to write a paper on the Netherlands and reflect on that, is an interesting laboratory in Western Europe to see what happens when changes can come and be channeled into the system so quickly because of proportionality, right? So I think you want to kind of maybe make that point, or think also more about some more long-term perspective. Then, secondly, and this is not for you, but if you take up issue yield, and there are some people who do and some people who don't, and I think that for the side of the people who don't, they think that there's something fundamentally endogenous in the theory, right? So a party becomes successful because a party gets the most votes because it figures out the most successful policy that everybody supports, so therefore it gets more votes. So there's something there that I think some people, not so much with the valence aspect, but with this aspect of choosing issue yield on the basis of kind of preferences and then modeling it with outcomes, because that I don't know what is influencing what anymore. So that's not for you necessarily only, but I think the way you kind of use it in a slightly different way than Lorenzo and Till do it, I think you need to think a little bit about that. So, and then thirdly, and that's kind of my own work a little bit, so if the problem of a snapshot, and the problem of a snapshot with issue yield, is that preferences are endogenous, right? Parties' preferences are endogenous to what voters want, and voters' preferences are endogenous to what parties want. And you have one snapshot, and what does that then tell us, right? So where, about the question of where does this all come from, who's leading whom, what, I know you can't do so much of that but either acknowledge it, or because there's some discussion about that parties are strategically, and I believe that. I mean, I've worked on that a lot, that parties are able to strategically, mobilize positions, but you kind of just assume that the other side is not necessarily possible, right? So I just wanted to kind of flag it. Then fourth, and this should come to the surprise of Hans-Peter, because I'm more kind of seen as using the terminology of Gary and myself, a strategic versus sociological approach is more in the strategic approach, but you kind of said it in the presentation, like what is this about the kind of big sociological changes? And actually, the Dutch case, so many of the Dutch scholars are working on strategy stuff, that it will be really interesting to see more of the sociological change, because there are sociological changes. It's not without any reason why Geert Wilders is doing extremely well in the south of the country, and these kind of elements. So not saying that you want to do that in this space, but I would find that very interesting, and especially the discussion about social democracy, right? Is there something about these kind of the way, you know, like more large-scale changes that makes it especially difficult? Or are you really saying that it's because the Partij van de Arbeid is not getting their story right? Right? So the reason why they're not getting their story right is because they have such a dense and split constituency that they cannot get their story right? So I want you to reflect a little bit on that. And then one very small methodological point. So you use the kind of Twitter data, and Twitter is great. However, you also say that people select into Twitter which parties use Twitter and which don't. So you cannot observe Twitter messages of every party. So if we place parties or want to say something about parties, we usually want to have documentation, either newspapers or party manifestos or press releases, where parties give the same communication. Otherwise, it's very difficult to know what you're comparing, because you just lack the other side. So I was wondering if you could do something on a baseline with other material, like content analysis of some other material, like election campaign, just as a, and then I think the other one, if you're interested more in that, and this is really the last thing on this paper, if you're interested in the kind of Twitter, it's also like that how parties, I think you mentioned it, Mathilde, how parties use language. So Wilders is talking about refugees without talking about refugees, right? But then that has implications for what you're measuring. And so you need to kind of think about that. I have no solution to this problem, but I just think you need to kind of think about it a bit. Then to Joost, very short. So I think it's really great to, and I really enjoyed, I ordered the book, I haven't read it yet. You know, it's a lot of stuff that I'm very interested in as well, and to placing this in a larger context of these different types of actually consequences or instruments to deal with these anti-immigrant parties that are not just from the voter perspective, and the legal, media, and political consequences, instruments that you discuss are really interesting. So this is just kind of in the contours of his work, so I'm just going to push you a little bit on a couple of things to think about. So my first thing would be, again, that these instruments are clearly going to be endogenous to attitudinal change, right? So the degree to which you think that Marine Le Pen is facing a potential party ban now is because she's down, right? So we kick the dog when it's down, right? So in that way, thinking a little bit about how that fits in your story, or maybe I'm wrong, right? But thinking about how these instruments are used and if they're endogenous to kind of real big changes in attitudes will be interesting. Then also the different instruments to react to anti-immigrant parties, but in some ways, if you want to come up with a general theory, some of this you can only use for anti-immigrant parties because of the legal challenges often, right? So, or maybe you cannot, but not many parties say things that are constitutionally threatening. So that's interesting, but it does limit the scope of what you're saying perhaps on the legal side, not on the others necessarily. And then what I would also be interesting about, for example, is to think on the conditions under which these are successful, and you're thinking about that already. But for example, I think the way Sarah and I have conceptualized why these we call them challenger parties, have come up is because of a decline of voter loyalty and a convergence of dominant parties, right? That opens up spaces for these challenger parties. But the question then is, how loyal are voters to these parties? And that's important for you, because if I would do some political strategy, I would be more successful if the loyalty is very fickle. Whereas if the loyalty is very strong, and I'm just thinking about comparing this to the US case, where legal threatening against Trump leads to motivated reasoning of Republican voters. Their loyalty is so strong that they're like, well, it must be that our legal instruments are wrong. You know, it's not necessarily the question that might be very different in a situation where the loyalty to the party is less strong and motivated reasoning will not occur. And people are just like, well, this is, you know, the outcome of this kind of legal aspect is important, and I should withdraw from this party, right? So thinking about that would be very interesting, and then placing it also in the context of other systems where dominant parties have been threatened by legal action. I would think, you know, impeachment, or not that you can systematically study it, but at least as contrasting cases will be interesting. That was what I had to say. So that means we have a little bit of time, I think, for questions from the floor.